Hello and welcome. My name is Manna Jaspal and I'm an Associate Fellow at the Observer Research Foundation. We are here for a panel discussion on the subject Weaponising Geotech, Competition, Interdependence and Innovation. After the fall of the Berlin Wall, a belief had emerged in circles of power that trade was now to be free, the spread of which would lead to democratization. For 3 decades following the end of the Cold War, global trade remained relatively open, at least for the developed West. This era of relative stability has now been punctured by rising geopolitical tensions, notably between the US and China, and we are witnessing increasing differences in issues of market access, trade, and investments, especially in the technological realm. Weaponizing technology and connectivity along with trade, finance, and other policy instruments to try and rule the key technologies and industries of the future, as well as to improve the economic positioning and acquire political power over other countries, is a strategy increasingly being deployed by powerful nation states to gain a hegemonistic advantage. And this is a matter of great concern and threat to the free, open, and prosperous future we should strive to build. Therefore, it's paramount we try to understand the geopolitical objectives that are replacing the free and open rules-based order with an alternative world order, one that is to be dominated by the interests and the values of a few nations. In order to talk about this subject, I'm very happy to welcome our 4 panelists who will help us think through these ideas. Firstly, I'd like to welcome Mr. Paul Cadario, who's a distinguished fellow in Global Innovation, University of Toronto. We have Mr. Weifeng Zong, Senior Research Fellow, MacArthur Center at George Mason University. Ms. Frédérique Dosay, Professor, French Institute of Geopolitics, Paris State University. And Mr. Varuna Sridhanapala, Additional Secretary, State Ministry of Home Affairs, Sri Lanka. It is a pleasure to have you all here and thank you very much for joining in. My first question to the panel is, countries are leveraging their power in international institutions, and tariff and non-tariff barriers, sanctions are becoming increasingly common. Were technology trade flows always unequal, or is the current trend towards regionalization and localization fundamentally different? If yes, how? I'd like to start with Mr. Paul Cadario, and if he'd like to share his thoughts on this.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me to be on this panel today. The protection of intellectual property and physical property is nothing new. It used to be if you wanted to build a high-speed train, you had to steal it, and then you had to reverse engineer it, and then you had to build a factory. With data and information being something that is as important as the trade in physical goods, we embrace a different world. You don't have to steal the train, you just have to break into the servers of the manufacturer to see what the intellectual property is, and then you have smart engineers who will build you a factory like that, maybe informed by some of the pictures that have been taken. So we're not exactly in a different world. We're in one where we're looking at the intellectual property and indeed the value of non-physical goods that travel on the wonderful World Wide Web that was invented, rather than have to be sneaked out in an airplane or on a ship or in a container that's labeled coffee. And in fact, there's something inside that someone wants to steal. So none of this is new. The question of sanctions, in addition, you used to prevent Coca-Cola from going to places you didn't want it to go to, but there were always ways that Coca-Cola found its way there. Similarly, I think, with data and information. So we're not dealing with anything new, nor are we dealing, in my opinion, with anything that's being weaponized, except in new ways. And maybe that's what we should be focusing on and worrying about, whether these new ways exacerbate global inequality or whether they stimulate innovation that eventually finds its way to the parts of the world who so far have not benefited.
Thank you, and thank you for those very interesting analogies you made. I'd like to move on to Mr. Zong. I think, what are your thoughts on this? What do you think does weaponizing technology really exacerbate inequality, or is it spurring innovation in today's time and age? So, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, first of all, thank you for having me on the panel. I agree with what Mr. Cadario said. that it's not something terribly new, except that we are just seeing perhaps the same thing from the physical world to now what's in the virtual world. And so if you think about, I'm sure we will talk a lot more about US-China competition in this panel and in the larger conversation now too. But if you think about China, for example, right, think about the history of China after it's joined the WTO. It basically opened its border, opened its economy to the rest of the global economy in the more on the physical world. And so before China joined the WTO, the physical global economy was quite close, at least to over 1 billion population over there. But now that in the physical sense, China is part of the global economy. But if you look at the virtual sense, China is still also pretty much close, right? If you think about the internet, virtually anything that's popular that we use is blocked in China, right? We use Facebook. China doesn't have Facebook. We use Google, doesn't have Google. But China has virtually everything else that's quite similar to the technologies that we enjoy. The only difference is that you can't, for example, on the search engine, which is called Baidu, you can't really search, for example, the independence of Taiwan. Otherwise, national security operators might knock on your door. So that's the sense of closeness that we are facing. And I think the question now is, does it matter only to China, perhaps to the US, or does it matter to the rest of the world as well? And I think increasingly we are seeing signs that this kind of closeness, the Chinese version of closeness, might be affecting the rest of the world, especially the developing world, because China has the ambition of seeing its technology being employed or have it deployed to poorer countries. And when those countries join the biggest economic circle of China, it would be automatically joining this sense of closeness. To be in the same ecosystem as well. And I think that's the challenge we are facing because it's being propagated down the economic value chain to less developed nations as well.
Thank you, Mr. Zong. And I think at this point, I'd like to draw in Ms. Touze into the conversation, and we cannot not talk about data when we're talking about technology. And I'd love to hear your thoughts on how a few countries and how a few companies actually are really controlling data and being able to sort of, control major economic and political decisions using data in today's time.
Yes, I think that we're definitely in an era of tough strategic competition between great powers, and digital technologies and data are now perceived as instrument of powers. As a result, a number of trade wars are now turning into tech wars. And you can see, for example, if you take the issue of standards, there's always been competition to impose standards. And now, and it was a case with the 2G and the 3G and the 4G, but what used to be an economic competition now becomes a competition that has a security twist also, because most of these technologies have dual use and are now perceived as being not only technologies that can give power because it can help get economic power, but also because there are suspicions that it could be used for doing intelligence or property theft or whatever, intellectual property theft, and so on. So we have a sort of securitization of these questions that are making them really complex issues, and there's a lot of competition under this. And definitely the ability to control data is now perceived as a major instrument of power. So it increases the competition. When you do, I'm a geographer, and we do a lot of cartography of these issues, and it's very interesting to see the level of imbalances that there is in the world in terms of who controls the data, who owns the data, and there is definitely a very important competition between major platforms that can have control over this data. And these imbalances do generate power rivalries between states. It changes the power relationships between states, between the countries that have a lot of data, even if it's privately owned, but it still can give a competitive edge to the states and the countries that don't. And it also changes the power relationship between governments and the private sector over the control of this data. So these issues are now completely intertwined because of the dual effects of technologies, because of the strategic competition that happens both on the field of being able to collect intelligence in a context of exacerbated conflicts, but also being able to exert influence and being able also to build economic power.
Absolutely. And I think I really agree with you when you said that trade wars are really tech wars in today's time. And I think it would be very interesting to hear what Mr. Dhanapala has to say and what his perspective of the situation is, particularly from an emerging economy and a developing economy perspective.
Thank you for the invitation, and it would be delighted to join this conversation on a quite interesting topic. Sri Lanka, being a middle-income country, is still struggling to go for industrialization. So bulk of its GDP still depend on trade. More than 50% is depend on trade, but this composition of this trade is not heavy tech. So it still depend on some agri and primary products, but there are some emerging trend of other non-traditional products like software exports. So it is coming very rapidly as an export commodity. And in that context, this global trends as well as this trade scenario is quite important to a country like us. Because of the global competition or any other trend that could lead to weaponize or some other word that can be perceived in different ways. Because for industries, as Mr. Paul mentioned, we need machinery and all these instruments. So even for the software industry of our country, we need all kinds of these tech devices and other things from any part of the world. So we are better off if it has the competitive advantage of getting the best for the least price, or from whatever the source. So in that context, I just recall that Sri Lanka is still thinking of joining the WTO's IT agreement and still evaluating the pros and cons of joining this 29-member group. And I got to know that our industries, especially IT industry, is quite interested in joining it and openly said the government, please go for it, and we need devices and to technology come to the hands of the people without any barriers. So this is something that I can recall from my connection to the digital industry. But without dragging this conversation into one direction, I think of also thinking about not only the data security, but also about the food security, where these some of the genetically modified seed and other products that have come to the farmlands of the developing countries are heavy dependent on some of the chemical fertilizer of some multinationals and some other big suppliers. So we as a country is now going for a fully organic kind of revolution with the patronage of the government to rethink the agricultural base and the new technology that can be developed locally. That's another dimension I would like to bring into this conversation.
Thank you, Mr. Dhanapala. And I think that was, you really helped set the premise for, my next question, which was on how weaponization of trade flows are really going to impact the growth trajectory of countries, and how the developed countries are going to react to it versus the developing countries, and how, the trajectories are going to vary, and how really does it impact the countries in this regard. So, Mr. Kadario, would love to hear your thoughts on this. I know we briefly spoke about this earlier, so if you'd like to sort of delineate some more.
That's an interesting issue, and it depends on whether you're a government, a manufacturer, or a consumer. If you look at the way global supply chains, I think for goods, are established now, we've all gotten used to just in time. And with the pandemic, everybody's talking about what I heard an expert on trade say the other day, just in case. Now, is the American consumer or the European consumer prepared to pay 2-3 times for a face mask that's made in the United States what they now pay for a face mask that's made in China and shipped across the Pacific, even at the rates the containers go for now? I don't know. And it's just basic economics. If the price of goods and services that we now take, or the price of goods goes up because they're made in the United States or Canada or India, is that good for consumers? Probably not. Is it good for the people who own factories? Maybe. Is it good for innovation? Hard to say. And it probably depends on industries. For all of the talk about China joined the WTO and opened up, actually, the Atlantic Council has just done some work that says they didn't actually open up very much. They have some of the levels of protectionism that are renowned in other parts of the world vis-a-vis other countries. So whether it's Japanese rice and beef, there are many, many examples of protectionism among members of the WTO. So we need to be careful how we frame that question about competition. In the case of IT, it is trickier because there's a lot of innovation that goes on in the United States that's manufactured in China or in other countries. And so is our concern about where is this tech manufactured, where it might not have the quality that we expect, the reliability that we expect, or indeed might have security problems in it, which has been the debate about 5G hardware. And because the 5G hardware has chips that are sort of generic, but maybe they're not. And so we're having that debate among the Five Eyes. But again, if I'm a consumer in a rich country and my front door and my alarm system and my lights and my refrigerator all depend on 5G enabled devices, maybe I have more to worry about 5G being hacked somewhere because there's a Huawei router than I do if I am a consumer in a poor country who maybe does not pin their whole life on the internet and everything that allows. So I think we need to bring some perspective on this question, and acknowledge that it's actually quite complicated. And there isn't a single solution about hegemony and technology that isn't, shall we say, analogous in the physical world, but that we have somehow learned to live with in the past.
Thank you for that. And I think you raised some really interesting points here about how it's not so much about, not just about technology, but I think also understanding how there are some countries which aren't even as developed to have basic access to technology. So, so I think, would you like to take that on, Mr. Zong, about how 5G is really becoming such a prominent thing today, and how, I think, what are your thoughts on this? On sure. Weaponizing, yeah.
Yeah, I think the issue of 5G, it really is a good example that illustrates the point that Mr. Cadario raised. I love the analogy, by the way, just in time versus just in case. And a lot of the efforts now, not only in the US, but also in other developed countries as well, to try to create some distance from China, is really along the line of thinking a little bit more, at least, about the just in case scenario. And if you think about it, the way I think about it is just it's the premium you have to pay if you own a house and you find out that it catches on fire because you don't have home insurance, right? And so the next house you own, you better have a home insurance policy, but then you have to pay for that home insurance policy. So not that is it good for the house? Yes, it's safer, but it may not be the best for your bank account because you have to take out some money to pay for the insurance policy. And if you think about 5G, right? So Huawei has used to have significant market power in terms of the 5G equipment, and that potentially is a national security risk because But now people say that, oh, Huawei is a private company. It doesn't really, it's not really controlled by the Chinese government. But I think the line now between private company versus state is increasingly blurred. So that argument is no longer valid. And just imagine how much the Chinese authorities could learn about all this data about the, for example, consumers. And that's the power of what's called open source intelligence, right? If you just relying on data available in the public domain, you can learn a great deal about a country, and you could create a lot of invaluable intelligence. And so that's where the concern is that if the internet or the wireless world in the future in the country is all run on Huawei devices, what could happen to the national security of the country? So that's why the motivation of driving Huawei out of the market is coming from. But then you have to pay a price, right? Because Huawei equipment is really cheap, much cheaper than Ericsson and Nokia, right? But so if you use those European producers, then you have to pay a higher price. Now, there might be some other possibilities. For example, one very promising one, I think, is the Open RAN or Open Radio Access Network, where many producers can produce different parts, and the 5G infrastructure will all be run on software. And so in that scenario, you don't necessarily need to stick with any single provider, but you could have different parts, and then you just update your software. And so maybe that's a way out, because that could allow for cheaper components to be used, and especially that would be a great deal for a lot of developing countries too, because the cost will be cut way down compared to buying stuff from the alternative providers other than Huawei. But you could also argue, I think it's not trivial. There's a lot of complications there, because if you look at the Open RAN, then the security issue is also of concern, because could that be hacked, right? If it's all run on software, what if the cyber attacks coming from China or Russia or North Korea, what have you, could jeopardize your entire network because everything is run on software. So I think the question is very tough here, and all it comes down to, I think, is the trade-off when we want to have some policy that gives us a little bit more national security, but then you have to value that against the economic price we have to pay. What's the alternative? And how much, in addition, we have to pay for? And would it be worth it? I think Mr. Kadaria would agree that we're just talking about different priorities, right? And maybe for some developing countries, the calculation of security in exchange for sacrificing some economic gains may be totally different from the calculation that the United States have, different from the calculations India has, for example.
Absolutely, I think I agree with you there, and I think I'd like to bring in Mr. Dhanapala here into the conversation and ask him, how do you think we can make other emerging economies, right, like India or Vietnam, Thailand, Sri Lanka, how can we empower them, and what more can be done to build resilience in their supply chains so that they can become bigger, producers, and to spur innovation in these countries? So I think, what more do you think can be done to be able to do that?
Yes, Mana. Actually, there are a lot of similarities in the South Asian region in the way of thinking and collaboration, and with some of these the partnerships we have built in South Asian regional cooperation body, that is SAARC, as well as there's another one called BIMSTEC, that is wider alliance, including Thailand, Myanmar, and some other Southeast Asian countries. So that will expand the horizons of a developing nation. So there are some least developed countries, LDCs, some of which are benefited from the tech giants, maybe India or some other countries who can lend the technology on a very concessionary rates, and the people-to-people partnership is really interesting. So that is what we in the United Nations Cycle we call about the South-South partnership. So that is something that South-South partnership can do. Again, there are some linkages between and among the trade chambers, for tech trade chambers as well as non-tech trade chambers. So irrespective of political ideologies, they can speak to each other and come to a common ground of real profit and loss as well as the social well-being. So that is something that we can bring into this equation where the people will, at the end of the day, will get their best out for the best prices, irrespective of the global competition or a regional competition.
Thank you for that, Mr. Dhanapala. And I think I'd like to turn to Ms. Duze now and get, I'd like to sort of get a European perspective and understanding from you on what can be done to strengthen data policies around the world today, which will then have an impact on trade or supply chains. So I think Europe really has some very strong policies in this regard, and I'd like you to, maybe shed some light on that for us.
Sure. I think there are things that can be done at the international level, at the regional level, at the local level, involving different sets of actors. At the international level, within the Global Commission on the Stability of Cyberspace, we made recommendation for norms that can really help that. One of them was about the question of not tampering with digital products and the supply chain. Another norm was about the creating vulnerability equity processes so that there was responsible disclosure of vulnerabilities in products to improve the security of all products. And we made another number of recommendations that I think are important. And we discussed a lot about the issue of 5G and China, but we also had the Snowden revelations that showed us that there were a lot of weaknesses in the systems and that they were exploited for intelligence purpose. And that's the fact that these vulnerabilities were there does create insecurities that can be exploited by others as well. So I think that norm process is very important, but I think it is not enough. Especially because it's very obvious now that the discussions between states about the norms of responsible behavior for states in cyberspace, all these discussions are kind of in a stalemate right now. And one thing that is sure is that states will always manage to keep the ability to conduct intelligence operations. So they're going to keep some vulnerabilities that create vulnerabilities for everybody. So that means several things. First, we need to have also multi-stakeholder processes, governments, but also academia, tech community, companies, civil society engaging in cooperation to improve defense in many different ways, whether it is education, whether it is the security of products, whether it is international cooperation, basic cyber hygiene. There are many, many ways where we can really focus on defense in order to preserve the resilience of the networks. And I believe this issue is all the more important because, as it has been said, it's totally critical for the development of a number of countries that because the digital economy is digital technologies are really driving economic development and economic growth. So they are very critical for that. But I think it goes beyond that, especially with climate change and everything moving to electricity and everything being digitized. Our societies rely more and more on digital technologies and digital data. And we've seen how, in the context of the pandemic, this transformation, digital transformation, has accelerated, and we were able to continue working because of the digital environment. But we also saw during that pandemic that when hospitals were under attack with ransomware, all of a sudden nothing worked, and it created huge consequences in the physical world and in the economies when these things happen. So I think there is really a great importance in having civil society, having multi-stakeholder communities really push for ending proliferation of cyber arms, because whatever comes from state confrontation in cyberspace or other actors can be exploited by criminals or others, and it all undermines the security and stability of cyberspace, and therefore the security and stability of our societies and potentially our economies.
Thank you for that, Ms. Tuze. I think that really brings us to try and understand that how can we really depoliticize and de-risk this space, which is really important. And I think for that, I'd like to go on, turn to Mr. to Mr. Cadario. And so, we've spoken about trade and we've spoken about tech wars and the economic impact of this. But how do you think this, what is the impact of technology and tech wars on the political stability of nations today? How does that impact the political aspect of, and how does it impact democratization in today's world and the political stability in nations?
Well, that's a huge question that goes everywhere from nation states or their actors spreading disinformation into websites, particularly Facebook, that lead to an undermining of the faith in the political systems where they're being organized. And I think that democracies differ, but the United States, France, other countries have been subject to these attacks by hostile actors who didn't really care how the election turned out. They were more interested in undermining democracy. So that's one aspect. The other aspect is that a second aspect, I think, is are the big players, and I'm going to define the big players as the United States, China, and the European Union, actually doing different things that are actually going to converge because, for example, there are rules about data privacy that look to have the same goals but are being implemented in different ways. But in fact, the interest to protect privacy, and maybe China wants to protect privacy of individuals because it wants to monopolize, the government wishes to monopolize it for itself, whereas in the United States, the right and the left both say there's something wrong with Facebook and how it harvests people's data and weaponizes it, if you will, against teenage girls. Whereas in the European Union, I think you have the GDPR, which is the sort of state-of-the-art, boy, we all wish we had one, version of protecting individual data and personal data and allowing us control over what's being harvested. So that those issues, I think, are going to, I believe, converge in some areas, maybe for different reasons, but we may end up with a global standard in those issues. What worries me more is as we become more reliant on the things that enable the technology, the either protection or stealing of our data, we are going to rely on devices whose reliability cannot be verified, which will lead to suspicion and which may deny consumers things that consumers would really like cheaper medical devices, or things that will allow them to protect their personal privacy, whether it's with a cheap phone or something around your home, or something that will let you and your children benefit from education that's available on a 5G network, but maybe not very well otherwise. So that our faith in devices may eventually become as important as our faith in the political systems that we all aspire to, or that we all dream we believe we live in.
Right. Thank you for that, Mr. Cadario. And I think in the interest of time, I'm just going to take some closing remarks from all of our panel members now. And I think I'd like to hear more about what do you think, what more can be done by governments, by multilaterals, and by citizens to be able to, what more can we do to increase data privacy, and what kind of policies can governments come about to do so, and how can we create greater resilience in our supply chains and in our trade systems today to, that would also at the same time create political stability in nations. So Mr. Zong, would you like to go first?
Sure. I think the world will be facing this very difficult challenge of the trade-off that I mentioned. because behaviors of regimes like China are creating the need, at least for other nations, to increase certain security. And then what's not clear, I think, in terms of national security, we don't have the ideal world where, if you think about, for example, tax cuts in the United States, right? You have the Congressional Budget Office scoring all these economic impacts of any proposed policies. We don't have the same scoring system to measure the economic cost of increasing security. And I think that's where the government or policymakers may not be as accountable to the public as opposed to when they were making economic policies. And that's where I think the future, if we talk about accountable policymaking, will be at is how do we keep policymakers accountable when they are making all these high-profile national security decisions without us knowing the economic cost of it. And because I think the trade-off in created by China's behavior will be with us with a long time. So without this more rigorous way of scoring policies, it will be very hard to guarantee that we are making the right purchases, if you will, of security. And I think that's a hard question because it really has to go in a case-by-case basis, because when it comes to different sectors, the proposed policies might be different and the economic impact might be different too. That's the same. It applies to 5G, applies to the digital world and the physical world as well. So I think that will be a challenge that's facing us for a long time. And I think transparency, having more information and being more transparent with the public is the first step toward it.
Absolutely. Thank you. Being more transparent is definitely the next step towards it. Mr. Dhanapala, would you like to talk more about this from an emerging economy context? And, what are your closing thoughts on the subject?
Yeah, I would say that, privacy is one thing, but we see also that it can mean different things in different geopolitical contexts. And I think what's really interesting, we have GDPR, but in the end, the question is not so much how do you prevent the collection of data, because data is collected all over the world. Whatever we do, we leave digital traces somewhere and someone collects data. So the question is, how is it handled? What do we do with it? And how do we plan on accountability, transparency, sanctions when our personal data is abused? I think that's a better question than just trying to prevent it from being collected and exploited, because our entire digital environment relies on collecting and exploiting data. So that's one thing. As for resilience, I think there are a lot of things that can be done in terms of improving multi-stakeholder cooperation. I mentioned reinforcing the security of digital products, and I think that there could be maybe more norms or legislations about this. And there could be more cooperation within the private sector to make sure that the products that are released are more secure, because right now we're in sort of a race to the market where what matters is to be first as opposed to be the most secure product. I think there's a lot to be done to train the workforce, to elaborate meaningful cybersecurity strategies and policies at all levels, whether it's at the level of governments, but also within organizations and companies, have better cooperation on threat analysis, incident response. And there are a number of efforts and initiatives that have been taken in multiple bodies. One example of such multi-stakeholder cooperation is the Paris Call for Trust and Security in Cyberspace, or the Global Forum on Cyber Expertise. And I think these initiatives can be easily expanded at scale and also across the world. So there's a lot to do, and for example, in the Paris Call, we are working on 2 working groups. One is about improving the security of digital products, and there's a report that will be released during the Paris Peace Forum. Another one is how to create a global index for cyber stability in order to understand whether we're making progress or not making progress, and what are the different indicators we can use to measure that. So there's a lot to be done. Some of it has to be done in international discussion between states, but we can't wait for these discussions to go somewhere before we do more efforts, and these efforts can be done at multiple levels by multiple stakeholders.
Right, absolutely. I think we do need greater collaboration and cooperation between nation states to achieve this and to realize our goals and targets around, technology, tech stability. And what are your last thoughts on this, Mr. Cadario?
Well, I agree with Professor Duzet that we need international norms that are developed in a way that leads to consensus. The problem is, of course, that our trade-offs between security and privacy tend to vary probably within our own households, never mind across nations or with companies. So the challenge, I think, is going to be to come up with a standard where we're reaching for the top rather than racing toward the bottom, that everyone will think is fair, and that the companies and governments that are charged with enforcing those norms actually can agree on in a way that, whether you're in Beijing or Paris or Washington or Bujumbura or Brasilia, it'll all turn out the same way. And I think that's going to be the big challenge, but that's one of the challenges in global affairs.
Absolutely. We'll quickly move on to Mr. Dhanapala. Sir, what are your last, closing remarks on the subject?
Yes, indeed, it is very short that technology should reach every nook and corner without any barrier. So that is a leverage for innovation and to uplift the human race towards its next destiny. So we saw during this pandemic that the role of technology, the power of vaccines, and the medications, and all kind of other aspects of technology. So my idea is every like other speakers mentioned, the fora, every fora should be used to leverage that kind of penetration. So there are some instruments in the UN. The UNCTAD has a different perspective of trade and development, and it has a very open kind of a dialogue on various subjects, including technology and technology transfer. And also that the annual UN resolution on international trade and development is called for all kind of combating protectionisms and to rectify trade distortion measures and against World Trade WTO rules. So likewise, that my message is for all players is to help the technology transfer across boundaries without making it a weapon against some country or a community or a group.
Right. Well, thank you for that. And with this, we've come to the end of our panel discussion. Thank you all for joining in and listening, and a special thanks to our panelists for their time and for being here today to discuss this very pertinent subject of weaponizing geotech. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Manan.
Thank you. Thank you so much.